Now, in terms of the Jay and Pinckney treaties, these treaties are proof in many ways of our emergent weakness as a nation. And the Jay Treaty, we tried to establish with the British, we tried to get them to, if they could, leave their Northwest Territory posts that they had promised to do in the Treaty of Paris, Peace of Paris 1783, ending the American Revolution. We're revisiting that, kind of asking them for the same thing, negotiating out the same thing that by treaty should have been done 12 years earlier, or 4 or 5 years earlier. This treaty winds up getting the British to concede to leave, but it gains concessions from the United States that are so unfavorable that it almost doesn't pass the Senate. It's seen as universally unpopular and seen as a sellout in the United States. However, it does have one positive benefit, which is when the nation of Spain, remember down here, Spain controls New Orleans. When the nation of Spain sees the United States actually signing this treaty with the European powers which had been pushing around this weak new republic in a world of big, strong monarchies, it convinces the Spanish that it might be better to settle a treaty with the Americans on this right of deposit issue versus seeing the Americans perhaps move towards having common cause with the English. So it gets the Spanish, in an unintended consequence, back to the negotiation table. And the Pinckney Treaty with Spain grants the United States the right of deposit, which is the right to drop our goods off down the Mississippi River at the Spanish port of New Orleans without paying fees or taxes or having those goods molested. This is enormously huge and economically consequential for the United States during this time because this map doesn't show it. This map is flat. But remember, you've got the Allegheny Appalachian Mountains as a gigantic, impediment to travel right here along the spine of the nation. Rivers are your main highways during this time. There's no real road network. And so the easiest way for this entire half of the country to get their goods to the outside world, it's shorter, faster, and cheaper for you to ship goods from Pittsburgh down the Ohio River to the Mississippi River to the Gulf and out to the wider world than it is to try to take those same goods and ship them over the Appalachian Mountains to get them to New York or Boston out to the wider world. So this is an enormously consequential treaty for this entire half of the nation and their economic future. And so we do see the gradual recognition of modest American rights with this, with the executive branch and this new government under the Constitution. In terms of domestic problems that needed to be sorted out during the Washington administration, first of all, you had Native Americans in the Northwest Territory who had still been there since the French and Indian War, but now Americans claiming the land on the map of that area are going to try to move in and encroach. There'll be some British support to try to resist against this. So Washington dispatches a military force under Anthony Wayne into this region, the Northwest Territory. As you recall, the Northwest Territory is the area that is going to become these 5 states here. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, just off of Lake Erie in northwest Ohio, Anthony Wayne is able to destroy a major force of Shawnee and Miami Indians and force concessions to the Treaty of Greenville, which will essentially remove the Indians from all the territory east of Indiana and Michigan, and make settlement in the Northwest Territory largely opened up to white settlement exclusively, breaking the strongest Indian resistance the strongest remaining Indian resistance east of the Mississippi River. So with that, the strongest resistance east of this river is now going to be kind of pushed to the side, and this area is going to be wide open for white Anglo-Saxon settlement, which is going to take place during this time period. So the Treaty of Greenville establishes that. As for internal domestic disputes involving American citizens, remember back to Shays' Rebellion, citizens who resented a distant government authority that they felt did not meet their needs when it came to taxation purposes or mortgage foreclosures, etc. The Whiskey Rebellion brings up a similar thing. Part of Hamilton's financial plan involved the taxation of whiskey. And why tax whiskey? Whiskey on the frontier was the way that corn was essentially distilled down and easier to travel. It's far easier to travel with a dozen cases of whiskey, whether you're going to consume it or not, or use it for barter and exchange, than it is to travel with 50 bushels of corn, and it preserves and stays longer. So by taxing whiskey, Hamilton is placing an excise, he's placing an impost, another word for tax, on the citizens of the United States to raise revenue for the federal government to help pay off these debts and balance the budget and put the government on a firm financial footing. These farmers in western Pennsylvania, and actually not just western Pennsylvania, but all along the frontier, Farmers resented this tax. They saw this tax as being not just a tax on a consumable good, but understand that whiskey was used in many ways similar to how cigarettes are used in a prisoner of war camp. You don't always use them to smoke them, you use them to share it, you use them as money for something else, a so-called medium of exchange. So the whiskey was used and traded as a bartered commodity, saying, how much is that worth? It's worth a couple jugs of whiskey or whatnot, and people would use it as money. Because this was a currency-starved region on the frontier. There's not a lot of hard currency, not a lot of paper money there either. So whiskey stood in as a commodity, as an economic medium. So the farmers feel that not only is their livelihood being taxed, but in some ways their money is being taxed on the frontier. So this seems to the frontier Americans like something that only an alien, distant government on the other side of the mountains, with no connection to frontier problems and frontier life, would ever try to engage in doing. And so they resist this. There's modest uprisings to say we don't want to pay these taxes, and there's some shots fired. Some tax collectors are chased off. Washington picks his area to do this in. He picks Pennsylvania. And what he does is he marches into Pennsylvania at the head of an army of 14,000 people. Remember, the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces is the president. He marches in and leads the army into western Pennsylvania to basically, essentially set down that federal law will be followed and complied with. And federal law is followed and complied with. The contrast with Shays' Rebellion could not be more stark. The weakness of the federal government was shown by Shays' Rebellion and its utter inability to do anything about it. On the other hand, Washington's setting precedents. He's very conscious of this. He's setting a precedent that this new federal government will not be simply dismissed and people not called to account for it. He's not acting as a tyrant, but he wants to establish this government will not be that rope of sand that we said the Articles of Confederation was. So between these excise taxes and then tariffs and land sales, you have the primary means of raising revenue for the government before 1913. 1913, the 16th Amendment allows for an income tax, but prior to 1913, these were the only revenue sources. There was a lot more land to sell then, so there's some things that get done. All of this leads to political tensions within the new nation, as we are now on the cusp of the first American party system. The first American party system will consist of the Federalists and not the Anti-Federalists, but the new name that they're going to take on, the Democratic Republicans, or Jeffersonian Republicans. You can pick at that. But for our purposes, Anti-Federalists and Democratic Republicans will be the same people. You can sort of, during this phase, use those terms interchangeably, but we're moving more towards the Democratic Republicans. And what are their issues? The fundamental lines that are being drawn within the Washington administration in a nation that did not plan on having political parties was that you're going to have political parties. You've got people of like mindsets who start coalescing into factions. And what are their issues? Well, your Federalists, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, they argue that you need this loose interpretation of the Constitution, a strong central government, a pro-British leanings in foreign affairs because it made sense for us to be pro-British because they're a dominant feature of our economic and geopolitical life with Canada just our northern border. And you need to have a reasonably large and well-equipped army and navy to impose the will as necessary of the government when it needs to be imposed, as well as having a national bank, aid business, commerce, finance, etc. The Anti-Federalists, formerly, the Democratic Republicans, argued against these things. They represent the arguments of Jefferson within Washington's administration, that James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, the brains behind the Democratic Republicans, argued that you needed strict interpretation of the Constitution. You wanted to have a limited governmental set of power and authority at the federal level. Have a small navy, small army, because you don't want to have large standing armies. We should be pro-French, even if we don't help them out, simply because they're doing what we're doing. It's an idealistic stance to take. The idea that governments are established by the people, for the people, who consent to the government, social contract, natural rights kinds of ideas of Locke and Rousseau. They favored agriculture. The Democratic Republicans did, and thought that the government should withdraw itself from support of business and oppose these tariffs unless they were there just to raise revenue, not to protect industry in any way, not to pick those winners. And so you had business interests in America, represented by Hamilton the Federalist, versus, new AP history word, yeoman. Yeoman is a term for a small, independent, landholding farmer. In the view of the Democratic Republicans, the yeomen were the backbone of the nation, and they were the only truly free Americans there were. What made them free, what made them independent, was the fact that they owned their own land, and working by the sweat of their own brow on that land, were able to raise their own sustenance. As such, they owed nothing to any man. They weren't beholden to any man or any institution. So in the Democratic Republican view, America should become a nation of these yeoman farmers, a nation of small, independent landholders, because that's what's going to bring us freedom, not a big corporatized, large governmental system.